Good morning and welcome to today's event on the future of the Conservative Party. My name is Chris Deeran and I'm Director of Reform Scotland. Could I just ask everyone who isn't on today's panel to mute themselves, please, to avoid any distracting background noise. Really important that everyone's quiet, and if you ask a question towards the end, I'll ask you to unmute then, but otherwise just keep your mute on, please. I think it's fair to say we are meeting in dark times, given events in Ukraine. We obviously thought about whether we should go ahead with today's event, and politics as normal seems diminished by the scale and horror of what we're witnessing in the East, and it's very, very hard to think about anything else. But we took some soundings, and the view was that the condition and the behaviour of the UK's governing party, the performance of the Prime Minister and the Cabinet, the direction of the Conservatives, where they're moving, how they should be moving, it's just as important during times of war and crisis and what comes after as it is in more normal times. And I think the scale of today's audience suggests that was the right decision. So I'm delighted to welcome today's eminent guests, all of whom are from what I call the thinking wing of the Tory party. We have first Ruth Davidson, Baroness Davidson as she is properly titled these days, former leader of the Scottish Conservatives, and someone who, as we all know in Scotland, has rarely been afraid to say it as she sees it. Ruth has also just started a weekly radio show on Times Radio, where, to no one's surprise, she is saying it as she sees it. We have Jessie Norman, the cerebral Conservative MP for Hereford and South Herefordshire, author of biographies of Adam Smith and Edmund Burke, and a former Financial Secretary to the Treasury. Also with us is David Gauck, former Secretary of State for Justice and Lord Chancellor. I think it's fair to say David was a victim of Boris Johnson's rather unwise clear out of the moderate and the independent-minded in 2019. Among other roles, David is now a colleague of mine at the New Statesman, where his weekly articles are a must-read. I would recommend them to you. And finally, we have the excellent Donald Cameron, MSP, Shadow Cabinet Minister for the Constitution, and the man who seems to get landed with writing Scottish Conservative manifestos. I think of Donald as the brain of the Scottish Tories, which is a sorry fate he seems to accept with some equanimity. We're grateful to all today's guests for their time, especially at a moment like this. And over the next hour, I'll chat to the panel about the future of their party. We'll take some questions from the audience. So if you have something to ask, if you could send it to me using the message gizmo on Zoom, and I'll select the best questions towards the end. When we first talked about this event, there was no war in Ukraine. The Prime Minister's jacket was on a shugly peg over a remarkable and quite prolonged series of missteps, including lockdown parties in Downing Street, police investigations, and what appeared to be a general difficulty with telling the truth. It seemed then like he would last months and perhaps only weeks in Downing Street, but war has a habit of changing perspectives. But we'll come to Boris Johnson's position in due course. I'd like to start, as you maybe expect, by asking our panel for their view on how the Conservative government has responded so far to the Ukrainian situation. It seems to me that the MOD in particular, Ben Wallace, has been quick off the mark, morally resolute and pretty impressive. We're sending plenty of arms to Ukraine and have been playing a leading role in what amounts to diplomacy in this difficult situation. But we've also seen our own limitations in relation to Russia, in relation to European decisions. So I wonder what this war tells us about Britain and its global role in 2022. And I might start with you, Ruth, if that's okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things I've said on record is that I know I was a big dripping wet Remainer, but I think even if I'd been on the Brexit side of the argument, I'd probably be pretty furious that we hadn't defined a post-Brexit Britain's role in the world yet, that actually, to explain and to repeat to our friends and our allies around the world of where we see ourselves and how we want to contribute and what we want to do and how we want to do it. Because we've been a big player in the world and as not just with our permanent membership of the UN Security Council and within the G7 and all the rest of it, but also just the way in which in previous years and decades we've gone about shouldering our burden and being there when there has required international efforts and not just doing what the Japanese do, which is send lots of money and kit, but actually put boots on the ground and physically put ourselves at risk on behalf of others. I think in terms of where we are just now in Ukraine, I think for me there's huge frustrations because Britain has done a fantastic job of being an ally to Ukraine over many years in terms of training troops, personnel, putting people in there, making sure that we have trained their trainers so they can continue to train each other and themselves. On the military side of things, we were really quick off the mark when the troops were massing on the border to make sure that kit got into the country. I mean, you've seen the graphics on social media of the flights that were just going over and back, just dropping kit off. And in terms of, looking at some of the sanctions and trying to get things like SWIFT brought into the sanctions regime, we were pushing for that. But yet, if you look at the headlines, we're being hammered on refugees and asylum claims. We're being hammered on some of the kind of ancillary issues to the war, which is the stuff that we seem to be not getting right. And I think it is a real shame, because people like Ben Wallace are showing themselves that being unflashy and competent is actually better than having a nice soundbite, but not really being able to manage a department.
And Jesse, from your position on the government backbenches, what's the sense of how you and your colleagues are viewing the way the government's conducted itself in this crisis so far?
Well, I think I would rather agree overall with what Ruth said about the conduct of our side since both in the preparation and since the hostilities have broken out. And it is true that there have been important points of criticism, and it's also always true that there's more to the story than whatever gets on a first presentation. But I suppose the point I would make is that, slightly contrary to what Ruth was saying, I do think that the UK has stepped forward in a way that might perhaps have been more difficult within the EU, with its demands for a more coordinated reaction. I'm not sure that's true. The EU has a way of, even when we were members, had a slight way of dissolving in the face of crisis. If you remember in 2008, what got people going in 2008 was the nation state's ability to pull the ripcord and support the financial markets by being able to tax people and bail out institutions or nationalize them. And Germany doesn't seem to have felt an enormous restraint in the way it's conducted itself rather admirably under Schulz for being a member of the EU. But I do think we've been rather active and energetic, and I think this crisis plays to the campaigning strengths of the Prime Minister. And the question is going to be, when we get to the final analysis, how well set up were we? How serious had we been about the foreign policy threat rather than what you might call the security preparation, which appears to have been quite good, as Ruth suggested? And then, does this need for competence and critique of any seriousness apply elsewhere in government policy, not just now, but in the past? And I think there are whole swathes of government policy which start to look very weak in retrospect, by no means restricted to the present government, but to its predecessors on both sides of the House. And energy policy is one obvious area for concern. Another would have to do with what you might call security of supply of vital needs. And it may be the case that commercial society in this wider Smithian sense, of people ganging up without any individual nation state necessarily leading the charge, but a global sense of disapproval and moral and political and economic sanctions. It may be that that is the ultimate way in which the globe assesses and deals with the Russian aggression, but that doesn't mean that we weren't previously in rather a soft and self-regarding state, and we need to get a bit more realistic and a bit more martial, and frankly a lot more serious about aspects of our industrial, economic and defense policy.
And I feel that, as Ruth touched on, we've seen, unfortunately, a side of this government that has at times in the past caused some unhappiness among voters, a sort of apparent ideological steeliness and a lack of what can at times seem empathy, maybe even ordinary decency. And that's on show again in Priti Patel's approach to allowing Ukrainian refugees into Britain now. There will be cases made for what she's doing and good reasons put forward, I'm sure, but that certainly isn't the way it's been taken in the media and from I'm sure people we all speak to in the country. I think especially when compared to the efforts that are being made by other countries, we risk looking on that side of things mean and rather small-minded. I see we're now berating the Irish in case Ukrainians come to the UK through the back door, which really does seem pathetic. So the British public seem no less keen than those in other countries to provide a home for these refugees. What's going on there, and why have we ended up in this position? David Gott, could you take that one on?
Yeah, let me pick that one up. I mean, I agree. That is, to my mind, the biggest weakness in terms of the government's performance in this. I agree with the remarks that everyone else has made about the Ministry of Defence and Ben Wallace and the speed in which we got anti-tank weapons to Ukraine in particular, and you know, looking across the piece in terms of the response to the Russian invasion, that was enormously important, and one shouldn't underestimate it. But the weakness, I think, is most obvious in terms of the response to Ukrainian refugees. I can only think that there is a combination of some incompetence in terms of, you know, we've seen confused lines, we have seen, you know, announcements made then not supported by reality on the ground. There's an element of that, but one can also, I think, assume that there's some thinking going on within government, which is all very well at the moment. Everyone's saying, yes, let's open our arms to the Ukrainians and let's be generous, and that's where public opinion undoubtedly is. But the argument goes, give it a couple of years' time, and we've got large numbers of Ukrainians here, then the voters that matter to this government, a large chunk of them, are going to be pretty fed up with them, and they'll view them in the same way as they viewed the Poles and the Lithuanians and the Latvians in 2016. And then they'll say, well, this isn't what the Conservative government was supposed to deliver. And I fear that is what is driving the thinking here, that they, you know, with an eye on a particular part of the electorate, are wanting to avoid problems in a couple of years' time. They may be right that that is where that section of the population is, but it's still the wrong policy. Of course, we should be much more generous, so we should be welcoming refugees in these circumstances, and it's deeply regrettable that we're not.
And Donald, I don't want to make you the Scottish guy, and feel free to range as widely as you'd like, but certainly if you're a Conservative in Scotland, where maybe the approach to matters like immigration and refugee status is towards the more sympathetic end of things, it doesn't help that this side of the Conservative Party at Westminster shines through just at the moment of crisis, when people are really looking to the government, like other governments, to step forward with, you know, open arms and a big heart, I guess.
Absolutely, and I think in Scotland, you're right. There is a much more sort of liberal approach, sympathetic approach to issues around migration generally, but certainly in terms of refugees. And I think, you know, I've had lots of contact over the last week, as I'm sure lots of us have, from schools and people trying to get aid out to you know, out to Ukraine, etc. And yeah, it's not helpful. I mean, the schemes that have been announced are welcome, but there's something seems to be sort of stuck, and I don't understand what it is. And to me, it plays into a sort of wider view of ideology trumping pragmatism, which I think is somewhere that we as a party have gone wrong over the last 10 years. And you know, conservatism is taking the conversation a bit wider now. Conservatism has become less pragmatic, and we've become quite sort of theological, whether that's over Brexit, some of it over COVID. And I think that, you know, one thing I really want to see a return to is that great sort of tradition and the kind of views of Oakeshott and co, that we you know, we're a pragmatic party that does, you know, that wants to do things that work, and rather be imprisoned by sort of theological beliefs.
And Jesse, what's caused that shying away from pragmatism? The great Tory method when it's in government has been to be pragmatic and to understand where the voters are and where they might go, and to ensure that the Conservatives are on side with enough of them to win. But we have seen it, and maybe it's a pragmatism in its own sense of Boris Johnson looking at the red wall seats, trying to manage the ERG and the rest of it. But it doesn't feel like leadership. It does feel more like a cutting corners to win.
I mean, I think there are two or three different elements to it, actually. I mean, my previous critique had been as you know, and as I've just said, a kind of rather deep lack of seriousness about some of the trade-offs involved. You know, a belief that energy security didn't matter particularly, and that we were all going to be fine in a multilateral world of trading energy, and that nothing could disturb that. And that looks very foolish. A belief that the next pandemic, if there ever was one, was unlikely ever to occur, but if it did, it would be a flu pandemic, and we were extremely well prepared. These, you know, the belief that we could get by without having an industrial policy, where not to have an industrial policy is to have an industrial policy without knowing it. I mean, there's a whole series of extremely stupid things that we've kind of allowed ourselves to get into. But as you say, the Conservative Party at its best is a very pragmatic institution. And clearly the argument over Brexit, both within the Conservative Party and Parliamentary Party and within the wider nation, had the effect of as it were, tapping into a strand in public debate, which was very heavily influenced by social media and very heavily sentimentalized, if you like. And part of the function of representative government is to withstand those temporary moments of enthusiasm. And I don't know if you can hear me okay, but you know, to some extent, one of the effects of sentimentalization and social media is to create this illusion of direct democracy, in which every person who just happens to, you know, tune into Twitter feels they're an instant expert on parliamentary procedure and the operations of government. So the question of how we wind back from that, how we wind back from a permanent campaigning posture into one that is long-term and genuinely focused on governing and focused on asking really quite difficult questions about capacity and direction and will, that's, you know, the whole challenge for the next few years. And what we have to hope for is that we can build enough ability to talk about it, and then to get people to think about it in the way they act in government, to be able to make those differences really matter.
It may seem a secondary issue at the moment, but I am interested in what this turn of events on the international stage will mean for British politics in a number of ways, really, but maybe starting with the sudden centrality of the issue of defence and national security. And traditionally, the Tories have been seen as the party of defence. It's been one of their strengths. We've seen Keir Starmer recently, he's insisting repeatedly Labour is the party of NATO, which perhaps shows us he's aware of the potential weakness, especially following the Corbyn years. So I wonder how the panel think of this active role in supplying weapons to Ukraine and deciding national defence and security strategy in a very changed international climate, and standing up to Putin in the ways that we're able to, how that's going to impact on Conservative thinking and how the country views the government in the years ahead. Ruth, is that something you?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of come at this with two hats, because as you know, I kind of keep an interest in well, I used to be in the reserves, and I still serve as an honorary colonel of my old regiment and stuff like that. So I do kind of chat to and speak to people that are wearing the uniform, you know, relatively often, every month or so. And the issue that we have and always have is when you're not at war, recruitment goes down. When you are, and people see it on the news, actually recruitment goes up and things like that. There are issues about making sure that you've got the ability to deploy brigade strength overseas. And I think we're coming to the point where that's quite difficult. We're also looking at some of our strategic defence platforms, you know, so we've got, you know, 6 destroyers and at times, and they're great anti-aircraft weapons. They're fantastic platforms for that. There are some issues about whether they've got enough anti-ship missiles on them, because they don't, and we need other, you know, we need the frigates to be able to do that, and other parts of our defence posture at sea. But there are issues about the fact that there have been times, because of their propulsion issues, that we've had 4, 5 or 6 of them out of commission at any one time. There's been none that have been able to be deployed. So I mean, I do think that we have tried in various rounds to make sure that we have a defence posture that allows us maximum flexibility and ability to manoeuvre in the world. But I do think that you can't ever talk about defence without then talking about the other stuff, and that's about international relations, it's about foreign affairs, it's about diplomacy, but it's also about things like building resilience overseas. It's about development, and that's why I didn't actually object when there was a decision, even though I personally didn't want it, but I didn't talk too loudly when there was an amalgamation of the Foreign Office and the Department for International Development, because even though they're very different disciplines, you can see that there is an argument and there is a reason to try and bring them together. I think the issue in cutting the funding and then making development the ginger stepchild of what we're doing overseas creates problems for us further ahead. So I think there's a whole lot that needs to be unpicked in there. And if I could just come back to one thing that Jessie said, and that wasn't picked up on, and this is the whole practicality versus ideology side of things and the politics versus policy thing. There is an issue about being in government for a long period of time and being on your third leader while you're in government and not having that time to think through a framework when you're in opposition that you can hang stuff off. And if you have a leader that hasn't been able to define themselves because they've not been in opposition in that way, it doesn't give his cabinet and it doesn't give his ministers or hers when it was Theresa May the opportunity to make all the decisions that need to be made before it gets to number 10 and to have that cohesiveness. Because under somebody like David Cameron, because there was the 5-year project before he got there, I reckon 9 times out of 10, if something came up in the world, I could pretty much guess which way he'd jump and how he'd jump. And the people that worked even closer with him would be able to do that. And it allows government to work better, and it allows civil servants to second guess as well. And it keeps things going like that. And because there isn't a Johnsonianism, Theresa May was slightly different because she had such a moral and duty structure. You could kind of hang stuff off her. It's more difficult with the kind of flexibility and also the progression that Boris Johnson has. And we agree on many things and disagree on many things. But I can't second guess which way he's going to jump on an issue. And I think a lot of his colleagues probably can't either. And that makes governing difficult too. So I think there's quite a lot in there for a long-term government to try and acknowledge and then try and be able to set the framework to allow everybody else to do their job. And that would also come back to the army example, if I can, because the way you're taught at Sandhurst on how to command troops is the 1/3, 2/3 rule. You've got something that needs to be achieved. You can only spend up to 1/3 of your time making sure you've made your plan and getting out to everybody under you, because they've got to spend 2/3 of that time making their plan, getting out to everybody under them and giving the people beneath you the best fighting chance. And you also have to govern like that as well, because government is so big and it's so hard to turn the ship around. You need to be able to have a vision and a guide. And that allows you, when practicalities come up, to pivot. It allows you to do the practical things better because you're not clinging to ideology, because you've got actual policy and you've got people that can help you.
And David, you were in the cabinet and have sat through strategic conversations about the direction of government. If you were in cabinet now with this Prime Minister and having to think pretty fast about the rewiring of quite a lot of policy and taking big decisions that will resound down the decades, I guess, how confident would you be of getting it right? And what would you be advising the Prime Minister at the moment when he's taking these big decisions?
Well, I think there's a challenge, and Jessie has sort of set it out. Always coming back to the first question, how's the government doing? Well, we can talk about what the government has done so far, but there needs to be a lot of hard thinking about what the next few years look like. And at the moment, I'm not sure the country as a whole has quite come to terms with how significant an event this is likely to be. There is, of course, a scenario where somehow this gets resolved quickly, but it looks pretty unlikely. It is much more likely that this is going to be a tough, fair few years. And we are going to have to sort of, in a way, start again with a whole host of policy areas, energy being the most obvious, and work out, what does this mean for us? There's big questions in the Treasury Department. I know well, to what extent are we on a war footing? Are there issues of sort of national mobilization, a national mission in the way that we had a national mission with COVID? To what extent, do we need to sort of think through the structures of government, the objectives, the priorities, and really kind of grip that? Now, in all honesty, I don't think that's necessarily the Prime Minister's strength. Although, to be fair, what I hear in terms of the engagement is that he has been, in terms of the military engagement, he has been very, very engaged in this. But in a kind of reshaping of what the state is going to be over the next 5 years, I think there's a huge task there. And he's going to need the right people around him. So there is too much talent on the backbenchers. He needs to be getting those people into the cabinet. He needs departments that are strong enough to kind of operate, and secretaries of state who can grip a department and lead it and set out a mission and kind of get on with it. He's got to sort of learn how the centre operates with those departments, where actually the centre can't do it all. And that's where I come back to the sense of you need secretaries of state with departments who are given a mission and go out there and deliver it. And it's really, really hard to do in government at any time. But that point about being really quite strategic is a short-term strategy. This is about what do we do over the next 5 years. But I'm not sure. It may be going on behind the scenes, but I'm not sure that is there at the moment. Having gone through one crisis with COVID, there ought to be sufficient institutional memory to know, apart from enlisting Jesse's wife, what do you do to try and deal with these matters successfully?
And talking of strategy, we were in the process, I suppose, of working through our new relationship with the European Union post-Brexit and having some difficulties there as well as some successes. And I guess, again, due to this conflict, we've seen a quite remarkable and sudden change in the posture of the EU, which has so often in the past been divided on foreign and defence policy issues. And perhaps most remarkably, Germany is bolstering its military, seems to be willing to take on a position of continental leadership that it's tried to avoid in many cases in foreign policy. And there are cracks, obviously, in terms of access to Russian oil and gas. But beyond that, the EU response has been quite impressive. There's news today of joint bonds to finance energy and defence spending in future. So it all feels like something of a definitive moment for EU unity and purpose. And I wonder how this impacts on the Conservative view of the EU and what a relationship with it should be. Does it make Brexit a less good idea, an even better idea, or make no difference? Donald, what would your reading be of what this says about the future of the European Union and its changing relationships within the Union, and then also Britain's relationship with that body?
I think a lot of what you said, Chris, is right. I think the EU has shown itself to be much more agile in the last few weeks, more unified than I think anyone expected. And I think it goes back to something Ruth said at the start, which is that it doesn't feel like we've properly thought through post-Brexit what our relationship is going to be with the EU, with EU partners, with the EU as an institution, but also member states within the EU. And I think that if anything, this crisis should sort of rocket boost the UK government's approach to EU relations. We are obviously geographically close, all sorts of ties with the EU, and we're going to have to, in pretty short order, work out what kind of relationship we have with the EU in foreign and foreign policy, defence policy terms. I hope that's a very close relationship. I think that, I don't think it changes anyone's view of Brexit, but I think it's, fundamentally important that we have a close working relationship, that we share many of the same objectives, and that those relationships at all levels, diplomatically, but also ministerially, are sort of, as I say, sort of reinforced, strengthened, created, and really worked on in the next few weeks, months, but also going forward.
Yeah, and Jesse, what would your view be of what this is going to mean for the European Union as an organisation and its unity and its ability to act in the world as a unified and large economy, obviously, but also as a military power? Do you think it's going to change what the EU is and has been?
It seems, I'm by no means an expert in this area, but it seems inevitable that the EU is going to be subject to very significant further push to develop a much more integrated and coherent security and defence policy, and potentially to build on the very fledgling elements at the moment into a defence force or some capacity to project armed power. Now, that's going to raise all kinds of questions, of course, and there will be an interesting question for the nation states as to how it relates to its traditional reliance on France and to the emerging investment that Scholz is obviously about to play with a newly reinvigorated military presence from Germany. So I think we wait to see with interest. Of course, it was a catastrophic embarrassment for the EU to have had the conflict in Bosnia and in the former Yugoslavia on its borders, and then to have it essentially resolved by a NATO/American intervention. So they've obviously designed and desired to come together to try to reflect a much more unified front. And bearing in mind the amount of individual leverage which Russia may possess with individual countries, that's a pretty significant achievement. And the really difficult thing now, obviously, is going to be to maintain that integrity and double down on that firmness of purpose in the face of what could be a longer term, more protracted conflict in the Ukraine, if that's in Ukraine, if that's what happens.
And Ruth, the idea of a European defence force, if that's what we're seeing emerging, it's something that the Americans have been keen on because they want to ease the burden of NATO on them. It's something the British have always been a bit less keen on because we value NATO and the relationship with the Americans.
Yeah, and I'm, and quite unusually, I'm very strongly against Britain being part of a more unified European defence force. I actually think that sovereignty of our armed forces is key to us, and this is an area where I do have splits with some other people. Who happen to be on the Remain voting side of the Brexit referendum. I think we need to have space to manoeuvre because sometimes we do take a different view, and also because some of our historic and legacy interests around the world and responsibilities that we have because of those legacy interests mean that we have to be able to act unilaterally or with other partners that aren't the EU. However, I don't see a more unified European defence force for our EU, as in Remain EU, as a bad thing particularly. And I think that actually there's been quite a lot of quite impressive work that's been done very recently. I think it is long overdue that several of the big nations step up their defence spending to meet the 2% that other people have been doing for some time. I think the new Chancellor Scholz in Germany has blindsided several people, not just within his party, but within his coalition, about some of the announcements that he's made, and has used his position in the unfolding events in order to be able to push this past the point of debate and actually into action. And I think that's to his great credit. But what I also want to see is, because we are no longer part of the EU, because they are kind of getting their act together and are becoming more integrated and be able to have a greater efficacy in the defence space, that actually we need to work out what that relationship is and do a bit of work about how we have the best way of working and fighting alongside, when it is in our interest to do so, with EU troops. We've always previously done that under the NATO banner. They're now, for the first time that I can see, looks like to be an option where it could be separate, or it could be in addition to or combined, because it's not, the groupings aren't exactly the same. So I think it is about how do we fit in. But actually, I'm very, very comfortable, and have always very comfortable with the UK staying with the completely sovereign armed forces.
Okay. Just to return to maybe one of the weaker spots that the Conservatives have at the moment is the attention that's being paid to the role that Russian money has been playing in UK politics, and in particular in the Tory party. There have been donations and close relationships and peerages, all of which are looking suspect now and are being investigated if they weren't before. David, why did the Tories get so close to the oligarchs, and are we right to be suspicious that it seems to be taking longer than it is in other countries to sanction some of these individuals, in the sense that it looks pretty shoddy, if not corrupt?
It's obviously embarrassing for the government that this process is taking longer, that there are fewer names and so on. I may be accused of being naive on this, but I don't believe it is down to corruption. I honestly don't believe that there are ministers going around saying, so-and-so has given me some money and, we've got to protect them. I am sure that this is a matter of process. There is a question about, what is the evidential requirement that is met. Maybe government lawyers are being too cautious. maybe they're not being too cautious. I mean, the last thing that they would want is this to be taken to court and to lose. So I'm very quick to criticise the government on lots of areas, and it doesn't look good. They're on the defensive about this on sheer numbers. But I think to step back and sort of suggest, well, it's because they got too close to oligarchs who are funding it and they're frightened to upset people. I very much doubt, and my experience of donors, of party donors, is that they would feel terribly important and welcome the opportunity to have access to ministers. But if a minister thought there was any question that a particular policy decision which might go down well with donors but would go down badly with the public, or they wouldn't, they'd go with the public, and if donors think otherwise and they're handing over money in the hope that that's the case, then they're being pretty foolish. Can I just also very briefly, Chris, just make one point on the previous question about Europe and all of this? There's a slight risk of confirmation bias here, and that everything that happens confirms what I previously thought all along. But I do wonder, the British public, looking at this particular crisis, and they look at the contribution that Germany and France and other European nations are making. They look at what the Ukrainians themselves are doing and the extraordinary fortitude that they are displaying, and their desire to be part of Europe. Let's put aside the European Union for a moment, but to be part of sort of Western Europe and the values that involves. And what is very obvious here is the French and the Germans and the rest of the EU and the Ukrainian people, they're our allies. We're on their side. They're not the enemy, and that's not going to sort of, huge numbers of people are going to kind of be converted from a pro-Brexit view as a consequence of this. But over a period of time, a sort of sense of solidarity with other European nations, I think, is going to be stronger in this country. And to throw in one other factor, if Donald Trump wins the next US presidential election, and we are likely to see the US move away from us, and maybe almost under any scenario, maybe things have changed because of Ukraine, but it did look as if the US was sort of abandoning Europe. We are going to have to think long and hard as a country as to where our interests lie and where our strongest allies lie, and how we work with those strongest allies. And that's not a case for rejoin as such. Maybe it is, but it is certainly a case for a sensible, close, collaborative relationship with our nearest neighbours.
Okay, I'd like to try and seamlessly move on from the war a bit into some of the other maybe philosophical challenges, etc., about the future of conservatism. But I don't think we can move on without approaching or considering the position of the Prime Minister. And I'd like to ask each of you, I guess, about whether you think Boris Johnson is safe for now or for longer than that, or whether there's a bill still to be paid because of what happened pre-war, whether it's sensible to change prime ministers at a time of crisis like this. We've done it in the past, other times we haven't. Donald, you're part of a parliamentary grouping that couldn't see him out fast enough previously. What's your position at the moment?
So my personal view of his conduct hasn't changed, and I don't really have anything more to add to that. But we are in a very difficult situation. He is the Prime Minister, he's leader of the country, and I think at this point in time, he has rightly got a crucial role to play in all aspects of what's happening. And dealing with the defence, the diplomatic issues, the intelligence issues, the refugee issues that have cropped up. But and ultimately, I haven't changed my view of what happened a month or so ago. But at the moment, I think he deserves our support.
Ruth?
Yeah, I mean, fairly similar to that. When the tapes are played back of what's happened here, and we start looking at all of the issues of what was being asked of people, how individuals who are making such big asks of the country were behaving in their own conduct. I'll be satisfied that anything I've said has been spoken from a place of belief and, for me, truth. And I don't think I could have stayed quiet. I think in terms of, is he safe for now? I think even before the war started, my view was that, these things kind of take momentum, and the momentum wasn't there from the parliamentary party. And it is very specifically the Commons Parliamentary Party that takes the next step, if a next step is to be taken. And I think the war has pushed that back rather than forward. I don't see an appetite within MP colleagues to move against the current Prime Minister. That doesn't mean I don't think he was wrong, because I do. Yeah. I don't know how else to say it. I'm not trying to line up a big kicking. I don't particularly want to keep restating all the same things I've said, but for me it's the two things can be separate. You can believe that something was wrong, and that the price to pay for that, for saying something in Parliament that you know is untrue, for acting in a way that doesn't uphold your office, that the sanction for that should be to leave that office. But you can also acknowledge that it's not happening right now, because the people that have the ability to pull the trigger aren't going to do it.
By whom you mean Jesse and his fellow MPs on the...
Well, look, there is a reason why it's an anonymous process, and I don't really want you to put Jesse on the spot, because it's not fair, because he's the only person in this panel that can be. So I'm going to form a one-woman human shield for Jesse Norton right now. And I'm going to wrap him in my hair and my arms and tell you to back off, Chris, and don't you bully my friend Jesse.
Fantastic.
Never known Jesse to need a shield.
No, I don't think he does either.
No, but, Jesse, what's your sense of the mood among your colleagues at the moment in terms of the Prime Minister's future?
Well, I'm just very excited about the idea that I've got this magnificent shield, and thank you, Ruth. I think what is always in play in politics, in the absence of very clear demonstration, a police investigation with a criminal offence, a report of some kind that makes absolutely manifest what has gone on. We don't have those at the moment, but and therefore people aren't really in the position that they have been forced to choose on anything other than a wider pattern of behaviour, which has been enough for some colleagues. But in the absence of that, you're always making an all things considered decision. And what's the right thing to do, all things considered? And when you're in a wartime situation, which we're in a proxy war at the moment, of some kind, obviously that becomes an overwhelmingly important factor. And I think if you asked people not inside the Westminster bubble, but just up and down the streets of this country, in Scotland and England and Wales and Northern Ireland, they would say, look, this isn't the moment to be discussing that issue about parties. We can come to that in due course. What we've got to be doing now is supporting the government of this country, Her Majesty's government, in the proper exercise of its duty on behalf of peace and stability and justice, and opposition to this crime of aggression. So I think that's where colleagues are. That doesn't mean to say that they wouldn't reserve the time-honoured right of British politicians to have their cake and eat it too at some point in the future.
And David, this isn't the time? Would that be your view as well? As I said, does the bill still have to be paid at some point down the line, or where do you stand on this?
Yeah, my position is very, very similar to Donald and Ruth's. To be honest, I think if the 54 letters were triggered, I think they got fairly close to it. But if it was to be triggered now, Boris Johnson would win the subsequent election, even after having received a fixed penalty notice, assuming that is what happens. But there is a long time between now and the next general election, and I think this wasn't my view a few months ago, but fighting a general election led by somebody who, if he is found to have broken those rules and not been honest and straightforward about that, that could be very, very uncomfortable. for the Conservative Party at the next general election. So there's a long time between now and, let us assume, May 2024. So a lot can happen in the interim.
Okay. Jesse, I wanted to just, moving on from that, I wanted to touch on where we are as a country and you are as a government at the moment. We've had a period of pretty prolonged destabilisation with Brexit, COVID, and now war, and it's a pretty major impact on public policy, both in practical and philosophical challenges. I suppose in areas that might interest you, such as personal freedom, state interference, the state of our economy, and the Conservatives would traditionally maybe see themselves as the party of individual liberty and a limited role for the state. That hasn't really been possible in practice in the past few years, and I just wonder your view of that and how we might negotiate, or you as a party might negotiate your way back to something that fits more commonly with your traditions from here.
I think it's an exceptionally difficult question. I mean, the question of what role there is for ideology of any kind in an environment where the country is as indebted and government and the public finances are as stressed as we are at the moment, it's a very interesting question. And of course, the problem with it is not just that, you know, in 2007, it was regarded as infeasible to have debt to GDP ratio of 40%, and it's now at 98% or 99%. It's not just that. It's also the fact that, you know, how in that world can you define where an expectation of greater self-sufficiency and security is the dominant kind of national emotion? How can you define a path back to some of those lower cost, perhaps more productive, globally trading environments which might power future industrial growth and development? I don't know. And I think part of the problem is going to be that in certain key areas, vaccines is one, there are areas of armaments is another, defense provision. You know, we are going to have to become more self-sufficient than we had been, and that's going to cost money. And we have to think about what those trade-offs are. And historically, we've been very bad at doing that. Treasury historically has been willing to pay as it were, a premium to save for the future of roughly nothing. And in a democratic environment with a very heavily active social media world, constantly pointing out money you haven't spent, which, you know, and questioning whether provision for the future isn't really just impoverishment of today, those stresses are going to become greater and greater. So I think there's a massive democratic challenge ahead of us to try to not merely to practice, but even to articulate what a sensible long-term conservatism that recognizes the short-term inevitability of the kind of big state indebtedness we've got, and then tries to work our way slowly back from there.
And Donald, you, I guess, as a member of the Scottish Party, have been thinking about this in one form or another for a while now, because you're responding to what's being done at Westminster. You're responding to the climate, democratic climate in Scotland, and trying to find a way to balance the two, I guess, to win votes, but to be recognisably conservative while winning in a country that, or nation that maybe hasn't been too supportive of the Conservatives in the past. And Ruth, you were leading at that point as well. Donald, what's your view of how the Conservatives present themselves to the country at a moment when the policies and the challenges are actually quite hard to be a natural Conservative and deal with them effectively?
Yeah, I mean, in the last sort of 5 years since the referendum in Scotland, you know, conservatism has taken a backseat to unionism, I think, in terms of our offering in Scotland, and that's, you know, because we've firmly stood as a pro-UK party and have reaped the electoral benefit of that. And so I think that there's a, you know, the initial challenge for us in Scotland, at least, is to think sort of much more clearly about, you know, reinvigorating the conservative offering of the Scottish Conservative and Unionist Party, or at least rethinking what unionism is, and trying to imbue unionism with perhaps sort of more philosophical ideas around, you know, a kind of liberal centrist approach that, you know, I've always personally been in favour of. And you know, and the constitutional question in Scotland hasn't gone away at all, and it's still very, very polarizing, as we all know. So I think in Scotland, at least, the challenge is to try and try and rework conservatism. For me, that's about localism. It's about trying to speak, to local communities, and recognize that that devolution should happen downwards. And also, I'm a great fan of the enabling state. The idea that the state's role is to enable individuals, communities to do what they can, and that the state can be both big and small, as required. But we are in a post-COVID, we are in a world where we are now used to huge amounts of public money being injected into the system. And when you hear people harking back to the 80s and a kind of Thatcherite view of the world, I just think the paradigm has shifted now, and that we are that we are in a world where the state has done some massive endeavors, whether that's furlough or the vaccine, or that's where we are now. And as Jesse says, the challenge is working out where we move, given the huge stress on the public finances and the bill that we now have built up by necessity.
And so much of it is going to come down to the finances and our ability to pay for things. We're obviously a position where we've had to pay vast bailouts of the workforce through COVID. Our debt levels are sky high, as Jesse said. The size of the state has increased massively. We have expensive new funding challenges like social care and net zero in front of us. We have inflation and soaring energy bills, and now we have a war on top of that. And it does feel like the arguments about low versus high tax don't maybe come together with the complexity of the moment. I mean, if you were Rishi Sunak painting yourself as a low tax conservative to your backbenches, and in reality you're a vampire squid wrapped around the British economy, it's quite a difficult thing to manage. David, what can you solve this for us? Well, if you were at the Treasury now, if you hadn't pulled your hair out, how would you be trying to, what would be the principles that you'd be trying to steer a course through, and without destroying the party or the economy?
Yeah, you're right to say it's immensely difficult. I mean, I do think there are sort of short-term challenges that, I think we are more like March 2020 than perhaps we realize, in terms of some of the spending that we're going to have to do on renewables in the short term, how we're going to have to protect people from energy prices, which generally I would be against. I think you can protect people against the general living standard that the nation can live with because of its productivity. You can protect the poorest, but you can't protect everybody. But I think we are going to have to go further because of the particular circumstances. So I don't think he should be hung up about immediate debt and borrowing levels. I speak as someone who was there through the Osborne years, and a defender of that period, but I think we're not in that period now. And so short term, actually, there's a little bit more flexibility, and we are able to get our debt away. And our interest costs have gone up, but I suspect they're not going to go up much further. So I think we can probably do that in the short term. In the sort of longer term, I think it's the basic. I don't think we should be hung up about precisely what the size of the state is. Where I think Conservatives have got to be strong is, we will be the most efficient, we will be the most effective in ensuring that the money we spend, it gets to where it needs to be and is as effective as possible, and that the way in which we raise tax will be done in the way that is least damaging to our ability to drive growth, and pro-business, pro-investment, but trying to sort of have an arbitrary number, and trying to promise the country lower taxes than the country can live with, if we're going to have the public services that we need, I think is a fool's errand. And I think a bit of honesty and truth telling to the public about this being quite tough is going to be necessary.
And do we have the right Prime Minister to deliver that kind of message, I suppose?
I not obviously.
Well, I think we're almost out of time, and I haven't really got to questions, and I don't think I'm going to now, because I'd like to finish by asking Ruth, as someone who has led a party in Scotland.
A fraction of it. A little bit of it.
Fraction. I mean, you did very well. Yeah. What if you were at number 10 going into the next general election? What would your pitch be? This isn't a pitch for the job. I mean, I just mean with your own experience and the views of what you've heard here and your own views. What do you see a successful pitch being with everything we've talked about, with the state of the economy, with war, with Brexit, you know, with the problems about ethics and morality that we've seen? What's a winning pitch for the Conservatives going into the next general election?
Well, first of all, let me say, Chris, I think it's very kind that when you organised a panel for International Women's Day, you let the women speak last. So that was great. So thank you for that. The single one that you've got on the panel. But secondly, just thought I'd pull your leg there.
Thank you.
But yeah, I mean, I actually think that the forward narrative that we have is quite difficult because quite a lot of things that we have done in previous incarnations have now been undone by the current incarnation of government. So you can't talk about the 0.7% because we've just undone it. You can't talk about like lots of other things. So the narrative line for the party going into future elections, I think, is quite difficult. However, I think that the way in which you, and this comes back to what Donald was talking about in Scotland, this isn't about big state versus small state. It's not about where taxation lies. It's not about how much you're going to take from people. It's about telling people what you're going to do for people, what the future is. And actually, the current Prime Minister is often dismissed as being good at boosterism. I'm not entirely sure that in the current circumstances, somebody that can positively talk about a future is a bad thing, because this is, our resilience was so low after COVID. The last couple of years have been incredibly tough. The resilience of everybody in the country, looking around the world, seeing it on flames, and now a war on top of that. Actually, they do want to be shown that, you know, things are getting better, can get better. There's a plan for them to get better. But you've got to join the dots up. So you've got to tell people not just what you're going to do and give them, oh, you're going to have a gazillion extra police officers. You actually have to be able to have done the nuts and bolts and work it out and show them the road as well, because trust is so low as well. People won't believe an empty promise because they'll think it's empty. They won't believe any promise because they'll think it's empty. You've got to join the dots for people. So I think in terms of the politics going forward, it won't be about record. It'll be about vision. I think that plays to the current Prime Minister's strengths. But I think vision alone to a population that, you know, climate change, war, COVID, etc., is very tired, is running on empty, is the resilience is shot, is not enough. They're going to have to get some of the really clever people that work in number 10 to join the dots and show how they can get to what's going to happen next.
Okay, well, that's a lot of food for thought there, and a lot of food for thought over the last hour. Again, I'm hugely grateful to David Gauck, Jesse Norman, Ruth Davidson, Donald Cameron for giving us your time, and clearly there's an awful lot more to excavate there, and the ground is moving fast under our feet at the moment, so it's a subject we will return to, but we're out of time now. So thanks again to our panel, and thanks to you in the audience for coming along. I hope you found that worthwhile and as interesting as I did, and we shall see you all soon. Thank you very much.